Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I'm just sitting here drinking my morning coffee. Getting ready to get my day started, getting ready to squat. Again, I'm using the hook grip on my coffee because I need to work on my hook grip. And it's important, particularly for your weakest hand, to practice that hook grip. Pick up your coffee cup every morning using the hook grip with your weakest hand, help balance out your strength. Not a bad idea. Remember guys, hook grip every damn rep. Now, that being said, let's talk about trap training. I discussed some of this stuff the other day, another one of my little rants in a side video somewhere in there mentioning rack pulls. And someone said, look, if they're not the best trap exercise, what is? And then some other people chimed in saying, yeah, what is? We want to know about this. I've covered this in the past, but it seems to be such a popular topic on YouTube fitness right now that I guess I should cover it again. And I'm going to agree with a couple of other guys out there, like guys like Bugenhagen, like Alec and Kiri. Some of those guys, I think they have the right of it, just from a biomechanics perspective. What people need to understand, unless you're maybe a specialized athlete who needs massive traps that aren't proportionate to other stuff, you shouldn't really be focusing on the traps exclusively. Like you see a lot of guys out there who say things like, well, I want my traps to blow up because I just want to look bigger. Or they want it for a certain look. The problem with that is that I don't think they really understand what it is that they are looking for. Generally speaking, we'll get to athletic performance in a minute. But generally speaking, most of these guys want bigger traps because they want to look bigger and more muscular, or they're doing it for some sort of aesthetics purposes. Well, people need to understand aesthetics really isn't that subjective. And I'm telling you guys right now, as someone who doesn't have the classic aesthetics look particularly, I really don't. I'm not necessarily genetically built for it. I'm not lean enough for it. A lot of other things. Something I don't have. Something that I do not personally have. It's fairly objective. And we can objectively say, I don't have that look, right? There's no doubt in anybody's mind. What people are thinking of for this appearance thing with a classical aesthetics look, a well-developed shoulder girdle is part of that. And that doesn't mean your traps. In fact, when you go back and look at those sort of classic aesthetics, it's considered to be unaesthetic if your traps are too big for your delts. In other words, if you spend too much time focusing on your traps, not enough time building the delts, you actually end up looking unaesthetic and it looks ridiculous. I mean, a perfect example, you guys look at the shoulders of someone like Brock Lesnar. That's someone who has overly developed traps without proportionate delts. Does that look good? Like, does anybody look at that out there and say, that's the look I want? Probably the majority of you aren't if you're chasing a look. And that's okay. I mean, if you guys want to chase a look, that's fine. It's not my bag. But, you can use some basic common sense and objectivity and biomechanics and everything else to look at that and say, okay, what look is it you're chasing? Well, how do you get there? And if anything, if you're going to have an imbalance and you want that aesthetic look, if you have an imbalance in your shoulder girdle, you want it to skew in the direction of the delts. In other words, it's better to have delts that are slightly too big in proportion to your traps than the other way around. So the question I would ask guys, why are you wanting to obsess over the traps so much instead of saying, hey, maybe I should be doing exercises that bring up my entire shoulder girdle? I mean, a perfect example, the standing barbell press. Done correctly, it works all three heads of the delts, and it works the traps. In fact, there's enough EMG data out there to show that the standing barbell press, as far as the upper traps up here go, actually seems to stimulate them more than most deadlift variations. In other words, more than deadlifts, more than rack pulls. It's close up there with shrugs, right? It's up there. It beats them hands down. So the first thing I would ask guys, I mean, should you really be focusing on some sort of pull like that you guys are doing, a partial pull, whether it's a deadlift or a rack pull or anything else? You really think that's your best choice when you've got stuff like the standing press that builds the entire shoulder structure, right? Builds the entire shoulder structure and is a tremendous stimulator of the traps, apparently more so than most forms of deadlifts are, right? It's considerably better in the data. Exercises like that are what you should be using. Look at stuff like what did both Bugenhagen and Alec and Kiri, both of these guys, these are both coaches. These are both coaches with athletic backgrounds, sports backgrounds who understand biomechanics. What are they telling you? You should probably do stuff like maybe if you really wanted to specialize in that look and you really, really wanted to put a lot of effort into it for whatever reason, that's your business. I don't necessarily get it, but if that's what you wanted to do, stuff like a snatch grip high pull. A snatch grip high pull will enormously stimulate your entire shoulder girdle with a lot less fatigue and lower injury risk than some of these other things that people are doing. That would be high on the list. How about just rows? In other words, if you weren't necessarily trying to be disproportionate, you just wanted to build the entire shoulder structure, I would say things like heavy barbell rows combined with tons of standing pressing will build your entire shoulder girdle. It will help build the rear delts, front delts, side delts, all of that in proportion with the traps. But then you could do stuff like snatch grip high pulls. Hell, even power snatches might contribute. But people get this idea, that this obsession that they want to stretch overload it. And I'm not saying things like weighted carries can't help with your traps. But if you honestly think that weighted carries are going to stimulate as much growth as actual dynamic exercises through the full range of motion, you don't understand biomechanics. You don't understand what's been looked at in study after study. It doesn't produce it's the same results. And what you guys need to remember, a lot of these guys who swear by weighted carries for blowing their traps up, how many of them are on tons of gear? You guys need to understand all the muscles of the shoulder. The traps, the delts, and the upper chest are the most heavily androgen receptor heavy muscles in the entire body. In other words, the ones that respond to testosterone and anabolics the most on a milligram per milligram basis are those muscles. So guys who are blasting a bunch of gear, which is most strongman competitors, say stuff like, oh yeah man, when I do lots of loaded carries, my traps grow. Well, you're also on drugs that extremely and massively amplify the anabolic signal from training in those particular muscles. So anything that creates fatigue, significant fatigue in those muscles for people who are on all that stuff, they're going to see enormous growth. In fact, a lot of those muscles would probably be really big in those guys even if they didn't do that stuff. You got to factor that in. Then you look at those, how many of them are doing standing presses. That's kind of part and parcel to strongman competitors. So to bring it down and say, oh, it's just their weighted carries and that stretch overload that's doing it, it's absolutely not the only thing doing it. There's a lot of other factors. A lot of other factors. And that's the ironic part. How many of these kids out here who are talking about, well, this exercise and that, and it just blew my traps up, and then you go look at them and they barely have traps. Their traps didn't blow up. Like I look at them, these kids who say, oh, the rack pulls above the knee, and you go look at their videos, and then you look at them flexing and everything else, and they have little bitty baby traps, and they're doing tons of rack pulls with 700, 800 pounds, and they still don't have traps. Their traps don't look like these other guys are talking about. Doesn't really work that well. And again, it's almost this level of delusion you see with a lot of these kids who come on and say, well, my traps blew up from doing above the knee rack pulls. But then you look and where are their traps? They don't even really have traps. They don't have really muscle anywhere. They look like they maybe have done a few shrugs finally. And ultimately, I would tell people if you need it for athletic performance, let's say that even though we know the traps are not necessarily best built by deadlifting, a lot of guys and power lifters swear by building their traps up to improve their deadlift, because then the traps are never a weak link and it helps them tremendously on the deadlift. And the guys who do that, who all have the most massive traps, the exercise you see all of them do are power shrugs. And I'm talking 900,000 pound power shrugs. You see a lot of power lifters do stuff like that who want the overdeveloped traps. And that works very well. It actually works extremely well. But then they don't look good either. So the guys who are saying, well, they're wanting the traps for aesthetics, they don't want the traps to be a competitive powerlifter. They're not trying to get to an 800 pound deadlift, right? They're doing it for aesthetic purposes. Look at the guys who actually have done the real work that overdevelops their traps and look at them, and most of you guys are going, oh, they don't look particularly aesthetic. Exactly, because they have overdeveloped traps in proportion to their side delts. So again, this stuff gets misunderstood. It gets convoluted. And the reality is, unless you have a sport-specific application where you need traps to go all the way up to your ears and you don't care as much about the delts, most of you guys out there should be focusing on exercises that build the entire shoulder structure. You want to bring up the delts in proportion to the traps. Again, tons of overhead pressing, tons of rowing. And if you really wanted to specialize more in that, things like snatch grip high pulls. That's what will build your entire shoulder structure. There's no reason to ever focus, for majority of people, there's no reason to focus on just one muscle unless you have a very specific reason. You need to be looking at how can I develop all the muscles that I want as efficiently and quickly as possible. What's the best way for me to do that while bringing my injury rate as low as possible? And a lot of stuff you see guys doing with this isn't doing either one. It's not achieving either one successfully. All right, guys. Well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.